President Trump continues to clean house across the intelligence and national security establishment in the U.S. government. We've written reporting for the last few days about the firings at the Defense Department and the installation of Trump loyalists at the top levels of the Pentagon. Well, today, President Trump appears to have started clearing out the government's top cybersecurity officials. The Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, is definitely not a household name, but throughout 2020, it was at the center of preventing foreign interference in the election, both by preventing cyber attacks, but also by pushing back on internet disinformation about the election. Today, Reuters reports that the assistant director for cybersecurity at CISA was forced to resign. And the widely respected head of the agency, Chris Krebs, is telling associates that he expects to be fired. Here's what's particularly crazy about this. Just today, CISA joined several other government agencies in a celebratory statement announcing that, quote, the November 3rd election was the most secure in American history. There is no evidence that any voting system deleted or lost votes, changed votes, or was in any way compromised. It's amazing news. Imagine being the President of the United States and seeing that statement and being upset by it. But apparently, it is CISA's insistence that it did the job it was supposed to do, that it successfully helped protect American elections, that has made Donald Trump so angry. Chris Krebs, quote, drew the ire of the Trump White House over a website run by CISA dubbed Rumor Control, which debunks misinformation about the election. White House officials have asked for content to be edited or removed, which pushed back against numerous false claims about the election, including that Democrats are behind a mass election fraud scheme. This makes your head spin. The top cybersecurity official, his whole job is to protect the integrity of the election, and he did. But the president says the election was fraudulent, so the guy has got to be fired. And in just a moment, we're going to speak with a key Democratic senator who has worked on election security and knows Chris Krebs about how concerned we should all be about what the president is doing here. But this story, once again, gets at the tension we've been talking about all week. On one hand, it seems very, very bad that the president is clearing house in all these national security posts as he refuses to concede defeat in the election. It can look sinister and scary. But if Trump is just firing his top cybersecurity official because he's mad that the guy debunks his Twitter conspiracy theories, well, that feels less sinister and more petulant and silly. And if you're looking for more evidence that Trump and his allies are not really engaged in a serious or competent attempt to hold on to power, today in Arizona, a Trump campaign lawyer attempted to submit as evidence a stack of online forms filled out by random people who claimed they had witnessed or heard about voting irregularities. Even the Trump lawyer admitted the forms were full of lies and, quote, spam. The judge would not allow the so-called evidence. The Trump lawyer was later forced to admit in court, quote, this is not a fraud case. It is not a stealing the election case, which maybe he should tell the president. Meanwhile, another Trump lawyer attempted to file an election lawsuit with a federal court that has no jurisdiction over elections. A legal dream team this is not.
Что вы видите? Офис 15 квадратных метров, швейный станок, несколько стульев, принтер от бывших арендаторов и сборник русского авангарда. А мы видим ваш труд. Ваши знания. Талант. Ваш потенциал. Работу в команде.
The Biden transition team is getting down to business in planning a national response to coronavirus. Earlier this week, Biden assembled his coronavirus task force, a team of doctors and health experts that will help shape coronavirus containment policy for the Biden administration, starting on day one, hopefully before day one. One of the doctors on that task force joins us now, Dr. Celine Gounder, epidemiologist, clinical assistant professor of medicine and infectious diseases at NYU's Grossman School of Medicine, and now a member of the Biden-Harris Coronavirus Task Force. Dr. Gounder, good to see you again. Thank you for being with us tonight.
My pleasure, Ali.
I want to understand. I know that there are many of you very qualified people on the two different groups that the Biden administration, or the incoming Biden administration, has put together. what does it mean to us on the receiving end? What does a coordinated federal response look like? Is it stuff that the administration does? Is it pulling all the governors together and creating a standard that makes sense? Is it using the CDC and the NIH the right way, unlike this administration is doing? What does it look like?
Well, it's all of the above, Ellie. I think part of what has been in the works for months now is developing a blueprint, a plan, how to operationalize that plan in terms of how to control the pandemic in this country. And that requires a federal response, but it also requires a state and local health response and the involvement of the private sector. And so what you're going to see in this new administration is you're certainly going to see the CDC taken off the sidelines, back in the center of the game. You'll be hearing from people like Nancy Messonnier and Ange Chouchat again. These are career scientists at the CDC who are really expert in this area. And you're going to see improved coordination with governors, with state and local health departments in terms of implementing the CDC guidelines. And finally, in terms of the private sector, when we talk about how do we scale up vaccines, how do we scale up testing, how do we scale up some of the new therapeutics like monoclonal antibodies, that is very much going to require the participation of the private sector to distribute and disseminate all of those new technologies.
Donald Trump has a lot of reasons for wanting to continue to be president. In fact, according to CNN reporting today, Donald Trump has been asking aides since 2017 about whether he can self-pardon. One former White House official said Trump asked about self-pardons as well as pardons for his family. Trump even asked if he could issue pardons preemptively for things people could be charged with in the future, the former official said. So what's the answer to that? Can he? And does it matter if charges are brought by Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York State, or Cy Vance?
I think first off, we should just take a deep breath and acknowledge the audacity of a president who's so clearly concerned about his own criminal culpability and that of his family members that pardons are a major obsession with him. And certainly we know one thing about Donald Trump, which is that he will do whatever he wants to do, whether he's entitled to do it or not. Whether it has legal force is an entirely different question, but at best he can pardon himself for federal criminal conduct. And what Attorney General James is looking at is a series of civil cases in New York under broad authority that she has under their blue sky laws to investigate persistent incidents of fraud by a corporation. It's meant to tell companies, if you're going to play in New York, you have to play fairly. And so she could theoretically bring perhaps one major civil case against him or an entire series of cases over all of these incidents. And that, of course, would be something he couldn't pardon himself from, nor can he protect himself from criminal investigations that are clearly being done by Manhattan DA Cy Vance. So what these two lines of investigation together show us is that there will be investigation.
Ладно, больше дурака, чем я. Дурак вот такой. Это меня никто не видит, слушай, Ваня. Сейчас скажу, короче. Я просто как бы настаиваю, вот как угодно. Скажи тогда, объясни мне, почему вот мужчина, ну вот я понял уже, что за сила такая, которая вытаскивает наружу эти самые, да, и так далее. Чем отличается? То есть, я не знаю. Наверное. Если ты мужчина, ты должен прожить как бы мужскую судьбу, ну типа того. Нет, ты вообще не про себя говоришь, что он просто понял, все себя вот так. Типа того, нет, ну и чё, ладно, ты про меня, мне вообще плевать. Ну и что дальше? Я частный случай всего лишь. Ты тоже частный случай. Вот ты подыскиваешь себе частный случай, который будет менее мигрирский, потому что тебе не хочется жертвовать своими мужскими Не знаю чем, понимаешь, вообще всем, да. Ну, да. Потому что как мужик ты не имеешь права. Ты должен сделать расчет, просчет, как его, ну не расчет, значит. Ну а как, все начинается с того, просчеты плохие тогда, когда мало данных, да. Искусственный интеллект, он ошибается тогда, когда мало опыта, да. Типа того. Да. Ну, понимает он себя, то есть, всего, да. Ну, например, он тебя понял, да. Вот он, ну, да. Нет, чтобы ты там не говорил. Да, нет, я не надо меня, я понимаю, что придется всего жертвовать что-нибудь. Потому что мир так устроен, что они все мигеры, все не на своих местах, понимаешь? Да. А те, которые нормальные, они, наверное, есть, но их надо заслужить, и еще не факт, опять же, да, понимаешь? То есть это не значит тебе, что надо просто, ну, наоборот только, да. Да, то есть они не обязаны тебе, как бы, быть твоим злом каким-то, да, понимаешь? Не понимаю. Ну да. Если, ну, наверное, если вот любовь, то есть, как бы, да, то есть, наверное, потому, да. Ну, смотри, какая штучка интересная. Вот она всегда, у всех женщин женское начало, у всех мужиков яйца, понимаешь, мужское начало уж простые, да. У всех мужиков у них есть энергия, которая вывернула их яйца, понимаешь, которая мужская, что у них яйца, у них там, это не важно, размер не важен, важно, что у них яйца со спермой, понимаешь, и тестостерон и так далее, то есть, что они мужчины, что у них даже не то, что ничего нету, что, ну да, но это как бы у них, ну это понял уже. Мужчиной называется вот это, ну понимаете, ну помимо этого, ну это изуродованный, ну тот, у кого нету матки, нету груди, так сказать. Яйцеклада и что ты там сказал, да, я понял. Ну да. Мужчина, мужского пола, к сожалению, все сводится к тому, вот, к телесному вот этой базе внутри. То есть то, за что отвечает женщина, за их натуру, да. Им вообще на это все пофиг, они не знают. В этом мире не придумали электричество и нету электричества. Баба спокойно, что понимаешь, я тебе объясняю, у них нет такой функции. Видишь, ты понимаешь меня. Я не думаю, что надо бить. Я думаю, что нормальная женщина даже типаться не будет, понимаешь? Да, и снисходительно на тебя смотреть тоже не будет, потому что я мужчина. Возможно, на душой, да. То есть, не то, что нормально, любая женщина, понимаешь? Просто все остальное это типа болезнь. Они не хотят быть такими, они хотят быть настоящими. Ничего не знать, ничего не уметь, ничего не понимать, да. Всю жизнь, да, жить душой всю жизнь, как-то так, да. Конечно, ты видишь, ну он тебя понял, защиту жизни. У них нету, они не хотят этого, видишь, выбор это пакостная тема. Да. Они этого не хотят уже, теперь, да. Вот, да. Кто за тобой вот ходит, вот люблю, кто тебя берет вот замуж просто. Да, вот и все. Остальное все слова. Да. Все-таки, к сожалению, такая, видимо, тенденция. Может быть, я ошибаюсь, но я на 100% знаю, что такая тенденция. Ну, чем больше ты даешь, тем менее понимаешь. Да. Если мужик порченный, да, ну типа того, да. Ну, никто же не сказал, что современный европейский мод, ну типа того. Это в каком-то, ну он понимает, это все уже понял от тебя, да. Ну да, вот так вот, как-то так. У меня здоровье по-другому, ну я понял. Формула очень простая. Надо ее, чтобы она была беременна. Ну, наверное, да. Чтобы зря не посидела. Тогда ты спокоен перед всеми, да. Ну а как еще любим? Ну, наверное, да, понимаешь. Вот тогда, ну ладно. Ну давай, ну, наряди ее, ходи на показ, может тогда кто интересен. Нет, ты с этим смыслом, да? Ну, как меня не касается, просто. Вот оно на самом, вот он понял тебя, представляешь? Страшно. Меня не касается. Вот оно так, понимаешь, остальное запомни сам, как говорится, да. Вот уж, ну да.
investigations that will survive the end of Trump's presidency, and he will no longer...
Вот там штучка, понимаешь? Вот ты чуешь, да, там собака зовет, я тебя понял. Вот так. Он тебя понимает уже, да. Вот я просто и говорю просто. Может просто жизнь свою надо прожить. Он тебя понял, да.
have the shield of the presidency to protect him from the consequences of those investigations.
Ever wish you could play guitar? Guitar Tricks makes it easy for anyone to pick up a guitar and start learning.
Suppose you know absolutely nothing about guitar. You've never even held one before. No problem. Guitar Tricks teaches you all the basics step by step. You don't have to waste your time searching YouTube for sketchy lessons. Guitar Tricks puts it all in one place with top-notch instructors. And you get to play actual songs, everything from the Beatles to Johnny Cash to Nirvana to Ed Sheeran. It's so cool.
Guitar Tricks makes learning easy, fast, fun, and has worked for more than 3 million people. Go to guitartricks.com/YouTube to get your free 14-day trial and bonus gift.
Достало терпеть и стараться? Сколько можно жить полусжатым, ходить полусогнутым, подчиняться чужим желаниям? Если вы не понимаете, о чем речь, и в вашей жизни все хорошо, можете закрыть это видео.
There's some talk about shutting down the country. What's the best way for people to think about what controlling the spread of this virus looks like vis-a-vis going about business as usual?
Well, I don't really love the expression shutdown or lockdown. I think we have moved beyond that at this point. Those kinds of draconian, lacking in nuance kind of measures, we've moved past that because we do understand a bit more about how the virus is spread. And really what we need to be doing is thinking about this as not an on and off light switch, but rather a dimmer switch, where you sort of dial up and dial down interventions as you do your surveillance, you see what's happening in different communities. I think New York City was actually a very good example of this in the last couple months, where in specific zip codes, we targeted testing and contact tracing on the basis of surges in those zip codes. We didn't have lockdowns across the city. And so we're now in New York at the point where we're reaching a tipping point in terms of having to tighten up on certain other things more broadly. That includes putting a pause on indoor dining, on bars, on indoor gyms. But that doesn't mean closing schools, for example. So I think we can do these things in a far more granular way that are less disruptive to people's everyday lives now.
And that those new restrictions in New York City will go into place starting tomorrow night. So it's interesting, the dimmer switch analogy. Dr. Celine Gowner, good to see you. Epidemiologist, clinical assistant professor of medicine and infectious diseases at NYU's Grossman School of Medicine, and now a member of the Biden-Harris Coronavirus Task Force. We appreciate your time and your service to the country.
My pleasure.
Разместите вакансию на ХХРУ всего за 199 рублей. Ведь здесь можно найти любого сотрудника, механика в автосервис.
Эй, куда дели?
Dear fellow scholars, this is 2-minute papers, secondary Disney paper from 2013 by the name A Material Point Method for Snow Simulation, which, to the best of my knowledge, was used for the first Frozen movie. I was super excited to showcase that paper when this series started. However, unfortunately, I was unable to get the rights to do it, but I'll make sure to put a link to the original paper with the same scene in the video description if you're interested. Now, typically, we are looking to produce high-resolution simulations with lots of detail. However, this takes from hours to days to compute. So, how can we deal with this kind of complexity? Well, approximately 400 videos ago, in 2-Minute Papers episode 10, we talked about this technique that introduced spatial adaptivity to this process. The adaptive part means that it made the simulation finer and coarser depending on what parts of the simulation are visible. The parts that we don't see can be run through a coarser simulation because we won't be able to see the difference. Very smart. The spatial part means that we use particles and subdivide the 3D space into grid points in which we compute the necessary quantities like velocities and pressures. This was a great paper on adaptive fluid simulations. But now, look at this new paper. This one says that it is about temporal adaptivity. There are two issues that immediately arise. First, we don't know what temporal adaptivity means, and even if we did, we'll find out that this is something that is almost impossible to pull off. Let me explain. There is a great deal of difficulty in choosing the right time steps for such a simulation. These simulations are run in a way that we check and resolve all the collisions, and then we can advance the time forward by a tiny amount. This amount is called a time step, and choosing the appropriate time step has always been a challenge. You see, if we set it to too large, we will be done faster and compute less. However, we will almost certainly miss some collisions because we skipped over them. It gets even worse because the simulation may end up in a state that is so incorrect that it is impossible to recover from, and we have to throw the entire thing out. If we set it to too low, we get a more robust simulation. However, it will take from many hours to days to compute. So, what does this temporal adaptivity mean exactly? Well, it means that there is not one global time step for the simulation, but time is advanced differently at different places. You see here this delta t, this means the numbers chosen for the time steps, and the blue color coding means a simple region where there isn't much going on, so we can get away with bigger time steps and less computation without missing important events. The red regions have to be simulated with smaller time steps because there's a lot going on and we would miss out on that. Hence, the new technique is called an asynchronous method because it is a crazy simulation where time advances in different amounts at different spatial regions. So, how do we test this solution? Well, of course, ideally, this should look the same as the synchronized simulation. So, does it? You bet your papers it does. Look at that. Absolutely fantastic. And since we can get away with less computation, it is faster. How much faster? In the worst cases, 40% faster. In the better ones, 10 times faster. So, 10 of my all-nighter fluid simulations can be done in one night. Sign me up. What a time to be alive. This episode has been supported by Lambda. If you're a researcher or a startup looking for cheap GPU compute to run these algorithms, check out Lambda GPU Cloud. I've talked about Lambda's GPU workstations in other videos, and I'm happy to tell you that they are offering GPU Cloud services as well. The Lambda GPU Cloud can train ImageNet to 93% accuracy for less than $19. Lambda's web-based... Dear fellow scholars, this is 2-Minute Papers with Károly Zsolnai Fehér. Have you heard of the Ken Burns effect? If you have been watching this channel, you have probably seen examples where a still image is shown and a zooming and panning effect is added to it. It looks something like this. Familiar, right? The fact that there is some motion is indeed pleasing for the eye, but something is missing. Since we are doing this with 2D images, all the depth information is lost, so we are missing out on the motion parallax effect that we would see in real life when moving around the camera. So, in short, this is only 2D. Can this be done in 3D? Well, to find out, have a look at this. Wow, I love it. Much better, right? Well, if we would try to perform something like this without this paper, we'd be met with bad news. And that bad news is that we have to buy an RGBD camera. This kind of camera endows the 2D image with depth information, which is specialized hardware that is likely not available in our phones as of the making of this video. Now, since depth estimation the image with depth information, which is specialized hardware that is likely not available in our phones as of the making of this video. Now, since depth estimation from the simple monocular 2D the images without depth data is a research field of its own. The first step sounds simple enough. Take one of those neural networks, then ask it to try to guess the depth of each pixel. Does this work? Well, let's have a look. As we move our imaginary camera around, this is not looking good. Do you see what the problems are here? Problem number one is the presence of geometric distortions. You see it if you look here. Problem number two is referred to as semantic distortion in the paper, or in other words, we now have missing data. But this poor tiny human's hand is also, ouch. Let's look at something else instead. If we hand is all, we now have missing data. But this poor tiny human's hand is also, ouch. Let's look at something else instead. If we start zooming in into images, which is a hallmark of the Ken Burns effect, it gets even worse. We get artifacts. So, how does this new paper address these issues? After creating the first, coarse depth map, an additional step is taken to alleviate the semantic distortion issue, and then this depth information is upsampled to make sure that we have enough fine details to perform the 3D Ken Burns effect. Let's do that. Unfortunately, we are still nowhere near done yet. Previously occluded parts of the background suddenly become visible, and we have no information about those. So, how can we address that? Do you remember image inpainting? I hope so, but if not, no matter, I'll quickly explain what it is. Both learning-based and traditional handcrafted algorithms exist to try to fill in this missing information in images with sensible data by looking at its surroundings. This is also not as trivial as it might seem first. For instance, just filling in sensible data is not enough, because this time around we are synthesizing videos. It has to be temporally coherent, which means that there must not be too much of a change from one frame to another, or else we'll get a flickering effect. As a result, we finally have these results that are not only absolutely beautiful, but the user study in the paper shows that they stack up against handcrafted results made by real artists. How cool is that? It also opens up really cool workflows that would normally be very difficult, if not impossible, to perform. For instance, here you see that we can freeze this lightning bolt in time, zoom around and marvel at the entire landscape. Love it. Of course, limitations still apply. Zoom around and marvel at the entire landscape. Love it. Of course, limitations still apply. If we have really thin objects, such as this flagpole, it might be missing entirely from the depth map, or there are also cases where the image in Painter cannot fill in useful information. I cannot wait to see how this work evolves a couple papers down the line. One more interesting tidbit: if you have a look at the paper, make sure to open it in Adobe Reader. You will likely be very surprised to see that many of these things that you think are still images are actually animations. Papers are not only getting more mind-blowing by the day, but also more informative and beautiful as well. What a time to be alive! This video has been supported by you on Patreon. If you wish to support the series and also pick up cool perks in return, like early access to these episodes, or getting your name immortalized in the video description, make sure to visit us through patreon.com/2minutepapers.
Looking for that perfect gift for someone? What if instead of wandering aisles or shopping online, you looked inside and made something from the heart with your own two hands? When you give a gift you make yourself, it can be anything. Custom and personalized and the perfect fit, even when it's not a perfect fit. When you make a gift for someone else, something one of a kind, never before seen and not sold in stores, it's just...
Я не могу тебе все ответить, но, наверное, ты прав. Одинокий, когда ты одинокий мужик, ты все равно будешь бабой, понимаешь? Да. Ну, свой, я тебя понял. Все равно какой-то добренький, все равно будешь какой-то. Ну, это надо для выживания просто. Все равно надо как-то заниматься чем-нибудь. Как-то себя чуть вылизывать, что ли, вообще там. Ну, да. Наверное, да. Может, это очень печально. Ну, я гипотетически так просто предположил, что для женщин самое важное это семья, и насколько они нужны, как их вот так вот там родные там бла-бла-бла, в доме у родителей, ну, я понял. Вот это. Ну да, то есть, да. Все остальное как брить собачий, да? Не согласен просто. Нет, деньги нужны, тут понятно. Да, ну, лучше типа, нет, до себя так не. Лучше папе отдавайте, вот ты с папой живешь, он распоряжается. Это просто для женщины, как они себя изнутри чувствуют, я не знаю. Но гипотетически так. То есть для них это зло. Распоряжаться, делать решения, принимать что-то там. Да. То есть они от этого тупеют, говорю. Да, становятся уродинами. Плохо для них. Они болеют даже начинают. Да. Но это не важно, вот что уродинами становятся, да. Ну, я понял, да. Не нужно ли они становятся, да? Не нужно, да, ладно. Наверное. Ну, не важно это. Да, то есть, я просто, да, там не надо. Не свои. Старшему в семье мужчине, наверное, мужик. Ну нет, сами-то неестественно. Ну, понимаю тебя. Ну, да. Видишь? Ну не надо. Все, тысяч. Почему больной извращен? Ну, ты даже так, хорошо. Не работаю, не надо. Нифига себе. Это не мне решать, да. То есть, да.
Dear fellow scholars, this is 2-minute papers with Dr. Károly Zsolnai Fehér. Whenever we look at these amazing research papers on physical simulations, it is always a joy seeing people discussing them in the comment section. However, one thing that caught my attention is that some people comment about how things look and not on how things move in these papers. Which is fair enough, and to this end, I will devote this episode to talk about a few amazing techniques in light transport simulations. But first things first, when talking about physics simulations, we are talking about a technique that computes how things move. And then, we typically run a light simulation program that computes how things look. The two are completely independent, which means that it is possible that the physical behavior of bread breaking here is correct, but the bread itself does not look perfectly realistic. This second part depends on the quality of the light simulation and the materials used there. We can create such an image by simulating the path of millions and millions of light rays. And initially, this image will look noisy, and as we add more and more rays, this image will slowly clean up over time. If we don't have a well-optimized program, this can take from hours to days to compute. We can speed up this process by carefully choosing where to shoot these rays, and this is a technique that is called importance sampling. But then, around 1993, an amazing paper appeared by the name Bidirectional Path Tracing that proposed that we don't just start building light paths from one direction, but two instead. One from the camera and one from the light source, and then connect them. This significantly improved the efficiency of these light simulations. However, it opened up a new can of worms. There are many different ways of connecting these paths, which leads to mathematical difficulties. For instance, we have to specify the probability of a light path forming, But what do we do if there are multiple ways of producing this light path? There will be multiple probabilities. What do we do with all this stuff? To address this, Eric Veitch described a magical algorithm in his thesis, and thus multiple importance sampling was born. I can say without exaggeration that this is one of the most powerful techniques in all photorealistic rendering research. What multiple importance sampling, or from now on MIS in short, does is combine these multiple sampling techniques in a way that accentuates the strength of each of them. For instance, you can see the image created by one sampling technique here and the image from a different one here. Both of them are quite noisy, but if we combine them with MIS, we get this instead in the same amount of time. A much smoother, less noisy image. In many cases, this can truly bring down the computation times from several hours to several minutes. Absolute witchcraft. Later, even more advanced techniques appeared to accelerate the speed of these light simulation programs. For instance, it is now not only possible
Наверное, можешь как угодно, шоу просто. Нет, надо работать просто. Это уже вас не касается. Это моя личная. Гипотетически можно это даже отсудить в суде. То есть я живу свою жизнь, это мое дело, что я так занимаюсь. Рыбу хочу есть. Да. Что тебе надо знать про меня? Я не алкоголик, но я сейчас безработный. Официальный статус мой, не тунеядецкий. Ну да, типа того. То есть, как бы, да, определенно развитые в своей области деятельности. И также там, ну как бы, ну понимаешь, короче. Да. Весь вопрос в фортепиано на самом деле, да? Понимаете? Какая у тебя может быть репутация пианиста, если ты вообще нигде не играл и не пел там и так далее. То есть, понимаете? Да. Если ты монтаж затягивал, он смеялся же над собой просто сам. Да. Ну да, понял меня, короче. То есть как бы это, как бы, ну да. Хитрованный, да, он тебя понимает. Ну нет. Ну просто семья, ну ты нет. А кто меня берет на работу? Конечно, нет. Нет, про себя они так думают. Я нарисовал кучу смс-ок. Что за смс-ок? Ну, смс-ок не было. Сообщение, ну, там, да.